gang, welcome back to another wonderful lecture. At least I think they're wonderful. I hope you guys do too. We are going to pick up today on talking about the endocrine response to strength training or resistance training. I also am going to fold in a couple of things on endurance training as well, just because endurance training never gets the same recognition that strength training does. So I might throw some of those in there just to keep you guys on your toes. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, we are going to basically talk about how we can produce these really robust responses of these hormones. And today we're going to be talking a lot about these primary anabolic hormones. Sorry, I've been speaking all day. So we're going to be talking about things like IGF-1. And as you can see, when we have the secretion of IGF-1, which is insulin-like growth factor 1, right? That is an anabolic hormone. And we've been talking a lot about anabolism and creating size and creating muscle density and creating this, fostering this growth signal in the body. We are talking about just that, growth. If you can see here, when we have IGF, which is a hormone, and it's binding to a receptor, we've been talking about those receptors for the last week now. This is the IGF-1 receptor, right? It's a very specific receptor that is designed specifically for this hormone. Well, that interaction between the ligand, which is the hormone, and the receptor is going to basically activate this signaling cascade. And you can see here, all of these proteins will turn on. These membrane-bound proteins, PIP3, will turn on. That will activate this. This will activate that. This will inhibit that. And then this will further activate this and all of these, right? So this is that intracellular cascade where the message that is stored here in the hormone has to be unloaded here in the receptor, and then that message will travel down by the activation of these proteins. And ultimately, when we're talking about anabolic hormones, we're talking about protein synthesis and also perhaps inhibiting autophagy, which is the destruction of certain proteins in the cells. So this signal is going to increase protein synthesis, and you can see here that this is going to be inhibited. Okay, so let's talk about these primary anabolic hormones, and let's do a little bit of a review on what we talked about last week. So we talked a little bit about testosterone, we talked a little bit about growth factor, and we're going to really focus on these today. I'm going to get rid of that because that's going to drive me nuts. So we're going to talk about testosterone, growth hormones, and insulin-like growth factors. And we're going to get into some nitty-gritty about this, get into some details about it. And then a recap. Last week we talked about how we can increase the amount of stored and synthesized hormones, and we know that exercise is going to do that, right? So we can increase, let me draw, I feel weird not drawing now. Okay, so we can increase both the storage and the creation, the synthesis of those hormones. We talked about receptor expression on target tissue, so we can increase receptor expression through exercise. And then when we stop exercising, we can decrease receptor expression, and we call that upregulation and downregulation. We talked about receptor types. As you saw in our last lecture, each hormone demands its own unique receptor, and that's just to kind of protect you so that we don't have the wrong signals binding to the wrong cells and telling the cells to do different things they shouldn't do. And then we know that if we upregulate a receptor or we downregulate a receptor, that can have an impact on how the hormone interacts with the cell, okay? And if we're talking about steroid receptors, we're talking about the cell nucleus, right? But ultimately, the reason I put this picture up here is because I've been trying to tell you in my other classes that ultimately exercise impacts the genes first, right? So if we have this hormone being released because we are now exercising quite a bit, and it's binding to its receptor, and we have all this intercellular communication as a result of IGF-1 binding to its receptor, right? We turn on IRS-1, we turn on PI3K, we activate PIP2, which then turns into PIP3, we activate PDK1, then AKT and mTOR become activated. That activates GSK3B, and then GSK3B is going to activate a signal which is going to cause protein synthesis. Now, where is that protein synthesis happening? Well, you can see it right here. It's happening at the gene level, right? It's turning on genes. So when we have this binding and we tell it to increase protein synthesis, it's happening at the DNA. All right, so the hormone is the message, and the message that is embedded in that hormone has to bind to a receptor. That message then, via the receptor, has to successfully be propagated down these different pathways, and then it has to hit its mark by turning on the gene, and then we have protein synthesis, okay? So that's what I would like you to appreciate here. Now, we're going to talk about increased anabolic signaling. And how can we program resistance training to the best of our ability and take advantage of hormone response, specifically anabolic hormone response? So we have to think about how we're going to leverage the increase of hormones with the training. So we know that adaptations can be attained, right? We know that that's why we exercise, and the amount of the synthesis and storage of hormones, the receptor expression on the target tissue, and the degree of interaction are all going to increase with resistance training. That is why we are doing this. We want to increase hormone expression, right? And we're talking about IGF-1 right now, which is a growth hormone. We want to increase receptor expression, right? We want to increase the interaction of more hormones with more receptors. So we hope that we can upregulate more of these insulin-like growth receptors. That's another receptor, right, that just kind of looks like this guy there, thereby allowing more hormones to bind to these receptors, and then really amplifying this intracellular signal to get exactly what we want, which is more protein synthesis, right? So we hope that by successfully prescribing exercise, putting our athletes through the right workouts, and understanding what's going on under the hood, which is this stuff, we can get a bigger, stronger, faster, and more explosive athlete. So let's dig into testosterone just a little deeper now. So we know that exercise variables, they can increase testosterone concentration. So there's a right way and a wrong way to increase testosterone. We're going to talk about that. We know that this is the primary hormone that interacts with skeletal muscle, and we know that it's going to bind to a receptor. And then since testosterone is a steroid hormone, we know it's going to bind to a steroid receptor. The book talks about changes in circulation of testosterone concentrations, and that this is dramatic when we work out, and especially in younger boys. This is more robust. Testosterone, interestingly, not only impacts muscle, but it also impacts other tissue within the body, which is why testosterone is such an important growth hormone. We'll talk about this momentarily. And then we also know that even though it's increased in the circulation, I think that got cut off, I apologize, following aerobic endurance exercise, there's not much hypertrophy that exists there. So one of the things that can shut the hypertrophy down in aerobic exercise and aerobic muscles is this oxidative stress. And if you guys don't know what oxidative stress is, if we have our mitochondria right inside of the muscle, this is my matrix right here, right? Well, since the mitochondria has an electron transport chain, that means mitochondria is using oxygen, O2, and using electrons to create ATP, right? We know that. That's what the electron transport chain is for, right? And when we have a mitochondria and the presence of oxygen in the presence of electrons, well, we naturally start producing things called free radicals, right? Or reactive oxidative species, right? And even during exercise, we produce these reactive oxidative species. And if you think about hypertrophy and aerobic endurance exercise, we know that we are primarily using those type 1 fibers that have a lot of mitochondria, right? Because we're relying on that for ATP production. So if we have a lot of free radicals floating around because of the mitochondria, they believe that that is something that will shut off the hypertrophy signal. Now, by no means am I going to ask you to memorize all this. I'm just telling you that that's why endurance training, even if we get some circulation of testosterone, that's why with endurance training, those type 1 fibers really won't get big and undergo hypertrophy like the type 2A and type 2X fibers. So just kind of keep that in mind. So what's so interesting about testosterone is it doesn't just play a role in interacting with skeletal muscle and helping skeletal muscle grow, but it also acts on the brain and on the spinal cord and on the central nervous system. So how does this improve performance? Well, if it's acting in the brain, then that means that the messages that are received from the outside world and translated to the brain through the central nervous system, that means that the brain will be able to process the information faster. So we can see the areas that testosterone acts on in the brain. So you probably all know we have afferent and efferent signals. So when we grab a bar, let's say we're going to do a deadlift, we grab a bar. Once we put ourselves in that position to do the deadlift, the brain is essentially evaluating what is happening. It's evaluating where your body is in space. It's evaluating how much tension you're building in your body in preparation for lifting that deadlift. It's trying to evaluate how much weight is on the bar. And then when you start to lift the weight, your brain is in constant communication with the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the motor neuron, and everything else that is firing at the same time. So if we can increase the synapses in our brain and increase essentially how quickly the brain can process information, well, that's ultimately going to help in performance. So testosterone, again, is beneficial on brain development and brain remodeling when it comes to neurons in the brain. Likewise, it also has a profound effect on the central nervous system. If you guys can see here, there was a study that was conducted recently in the central nervous system, or in rodents, where they were looking at the central nervous system, and essentially they castrated some of these male rodents so that they couldn't produce testosterone. And they found that the rodents who were not castrated had a way more robust response in central nervous system activity, activation, and remodeling, where castrated males, rodents who were unable to produce testosterone because of the procedure, they essentially could not produce enough testosterone to help in central nervous system remodeling and neuron remodeling. So we believe that testosterone is also playing a role in neural remodeling in the human body. So let's talk a little bit about variables for trying to produce robust responses in testosterone. So this is going to be very generic, but I want you to start thinking about the athletes that you're working with or the athletes that you want to work with. I want you to start thinking about how we're going to apply resistance training as a stimulus to get the most robust response that we can from testosterone. Now, the very generic variables that we're going to talk about, this is right from the NSCA textbook, is if we want to increase testosterone concentrations and thereby increasing hopefully receptors and endocrine signaling, we have to do large muscle groups, right? So we have to work as many big, large muscles as we can simultaneously. Also, research is showing that the heavier the lifting, the more robust the response. So if we're doing heavy resistance training, we want to have 85% to 95% of your 1 rep max, and we want to be activating large muscle groups. Now, you guys just recently did your 1 rep max testing. You understood what a 1 rep max is. We showed you several ways you can obtain the 1 rep max, even looking at the Holton curve. So that's why we obtain the 1 rep max, is because we want to talk about what that range will be that'll be most profound on testosterone creation and circulation. Moderate to high volume of exercise can also increase that range. Okay, so these two might slightly work against one another. So you have a choice to make. Are we going to do low volume, high weight, or high volume, lower weight? And that weight here would look like probably 65 to 75% of your 1 rep max. We want to have short rests. So the shorter the rest, the greater the activation of testosterone. So if your guys are doing a 3-minute rest, we could be slightly hurting the concentration of testosterone. Long-term resistance training, obviously, the longer we do it, the more circulation we're going to have. So if you do it for 6 months and then you quit, you're going to have way less circulation of testosterone, where if you're doing it for 3 years and you haven't really had many breaks. And lastly, we want to tax the muscle groups differently and frequently. We want to do it as much as we possibly can in different ways. So how can we do this? Well, we can do multi-joint movements, right? And we can engage as much of the body as possible. So I have a picture for you here. Which one would increase the greatest amount of testosterone? This or this? Well, I told you large muscle group activation, which is here. He's purposely activating every muscle in his body. That's fantastic. Now, of course, he's not doing 85 to 95% of his 1 rep max, so he's probably doing very high volume, which will also get a robust response. And as I just said, multi-joint movements to engage as many muscles as possible. So you can see here, he might have a bit more weight, but he's isolating his muscles by it. So in no sense of the imagination is he activating large muscle groups, because your biceps are not a large muscle group, and he's sitting and of course he's isolating. So the other thing that we want to think about is we want to get high degrees of mechanical tension, right? So we want to activate as much muscle tension as we can. And again, look at the difference between here. Lots of muscle tension, right? We have a primary mover, but we have a lot of stabilizers here as well. There's no muscle in the body that is not being engaged, where in this, we have every muscle in the body being unengaged except for this here. And if we activate large muscle groups and we do full contractions as much as possible, we are going to activate very high levels of serum testosterone. It'll elevate exponentially. So we don't want to focus on targeting single muscles. And just to kind of show you another viewpoint is if we look at this here, right? Yes, we are activating large muscle groups. That is true. The weight here could be 95 to 85% of their 1 rep max. But which of the two is activating more muscles? And that would be this multi-joint movement here, right? Here we'll have, if we look at this picture here, most of this individual's body is not going to be tense. The muscle activation is going to be here and here, and that's about it. Yes, we will have some tension here, but it's going to be very different than what we see over here. So we do want to increase not only the weight, but we want to increase our ability to activate more muscle groups, and we could also increase total volume, right? So we want to have volume and variations. We want to activate different muscle fibers, and if we activate different muscle fibers, we'll also activate different motor units, and we can do this and this alternative, right? We don't have to do this type of leg work every single day. We can go back and forth between a leg press and a leg or a deadlift, right? Or a leg press and a stiff-legged deadlift. So there's many different variations that we can do. And if we talk about variations again, look at here. So we could do chin-up versus pull-ups. You're ideally working the same muscle groups, right? But you're just taxing it in different ways based upon the hand grips, right? So in all of this, we do want to let's review this one more time. And if we want to get the most robust serum concentration of testosterone, we want to work large muscle groups, as many of them as possible. We have a choice. There's a fork in the road. We can do heavy resistance, or we can do moderate to high volume of exercise, right? So we could just decrease the weight and increase the volume, and that volume could be sets and reps will be much higher than this, right? We want to have as short of rest time as possible. and we want to be doing training for long periods of time. We don't want to do 6 months on, 6 months off. And then we want to tax muscle groups differently and frequently. And these pictures are just to kind of get you thinking about what that taxing looks like. We do not want to repeat the same types of exercises all the time. And again, that we kind of come into that plateau thing. Plateauing is not just an inability to lift more weights. If we look under the hood, plateauing might be a biochemical thing, right? We might be done adapting biochemically with all these things here, and that could represent a plateau of sorts. Okay, let's move forward. So the key points: large muscle groups, use adequate volume, use adequate rest time, and keep in mind that men generally have more basal testosterone than women. And they also have the greater surges of testosterone following exercise than women. So muscle growth in females may be more associated with estrogen and HGH in women than testosterone. So keep that in mind. Women can gain muscle, but it's not going to focus primarily on testosterone. It's going to focus on other hormones that are indicative to women physiology. So research is still being done on that, but they believe that high levels of estrogen and high levels of human growth hormone are going to be higher in women, and they believe that might be a mechanism that is equivalent of testosterone. So again, just another reminder, activate the muscle fibers and the motor units in different ways. We have this picture here showing a front grip, here showing a reverse grip, and it's essentially showing the same type of muscle fibers, but we want to activate them in different ways. I just gave you a representation of that here. I gave you a representation of that here. If we want to look at, if we look at this individual, right, and they're doing curls, there are better ways to do this, right? So if we go back to this plate here, if we go back to this slide here, and we're looking at, okay, large muscle groups, moderate to high volume, short rests, tax the muscles differently. Let's look at what a dumbbell curl could look like that would produce more testosterone, right? And I have this picture here. What is the difference between this, and this? And you should be saying that, well, this one is total isolation, right? This one is standing and pseudo-isolated, and this one is very dynamic and incorporating more muscle groups and incorporating more muscle fibers, which is going to have a more robust response. So I'm just trying to give you examples of how you can alternate things to get the results that you want, and we're just going to keep it within this generic framework for right now. So again, think about the athletes that you're going to be working for with your final project, the athletes that I asked you to consider at the beginning of this program, and think about how this might fit into their type of resistance training to get the most robust response, okay? So let's talk a little bit about some of the just basal physiological aspects that could have an impact on testosterone. So we essentially have both free and active testosterone. And we have something in the body that is going to inhibit testosterone, total testosterone in the blood, so that it regulates how much of it is free to interact with the receptor and activate those growth signals, which we told you were going to be protein synthesis signals. Well, in the blood, we have something called SHBG. And if you don't know what that is, it's sex hormone binding globulin. Okay. It can bind to both testosterone and estradiol, and it can decrease their biological effects. So we have this in both men and women, and it decreases their biological effect. So why do we have that? Well, because since these are growth signals, if they were circulating through the blood and all of them were active, that would be a condition that kind of mimics what happens with cancer. We have too many growth signals on at one time, binding to receptors, telling the cells to grow, to divide, to become bigger. So this binding globulin, and if any of you guys are in my biochemistry class, you guys now should know what a globulin is. We talked about that in quite a bit of detail. And this this regulator, which is SHBG, it's determining how much free testosterone is active and biologically available. So only about 1 to 2% of total testosterone circulating through the blood is active. So that means a lot of it is inactive. So some of it is bound to albumin. Albumin is a protein in the blood that carries fats and has some glucose that can bind to it as well. And so we get a lot of it bound up there, which leaves it inactive. And we get a lot of it bound up with that SHBG, which leaves it inactive. Okay. Now, when we exercise and we're lifting weights and using resistant training to increase our testosterone levels, we are uncertain if we're basically creating more testosterone or if we're liberating some of this testosterone here that is bound to these regulators. It could be a combination of both, but we do know that heavy resistance exercise, 80% of your 1 rep max or greater, can actively increase free testosterone, both in men and in women. So if we're doing that heavy weight, we can assume that these regulators are releasing themselves from testosterone, thereby potentially increasing this to 10% rather than 1 to 2%. Okay, so there is a mechanism that might be increasing testosterone, but we're also going to get an increase in synthesis of testosterone. So it could be both of them working together. Now, this is just kind of a review of things that might cause high serum testosterone. Maybe you talked about this in physiology, maybe you haven't, but let's just review it very quickly. Throughout the day, you are going to have variations in normal fluctuations of hormones, right? So generally hormones, especially anabolic hormones, are very, very, very high in the morning. So you can look at that here. Testosterone secretion follows the circadian rhythm. So we're going to have the highest in the morning and the lowest in the evening. So what if you're lifting weights in the evening versus lifting weights in the morning? That could be a factor that you might want to consider. It is higher in men that are young, and it's lower in men that are chronologically older. So we begin to lose testosterone production as we age. And that is why we have testosterone therapy, and it's so popular. Women, although they have much less circulation of testosterone, they appear to be more highly sensitive to it. So increases in testosterone levels as they begin to weightlift and use resistance training, they will also have slight increases, and I do mean slight, but they will become more sensitive to the signal compared to men. And there's still a lot of research to be done on this, but one thing that is becoming a bit more clear is the greater secretion of testosterone. That seems to also be having an impact on androgen receptors, and we talked about androgens in the last lecture. So let's just kind of look at the difference between testosterone and in men and women, so you guys can see the levels. Men are substantially higher than women. You guys can see that very easy. Men will peak with testosterone production at about 35, and then it's downhill from there. And women have a slightly different testosterone pattern. They will begin to plummet in their early age, and then once they hit about 40, they'll start to kind of reverse that, and it will go up. So one of the things I want to show you on the next slide is going to focus on this, and this is just kind of showing you what testosterone is doing while you work out, right? So we have free testosterone and we have total testosterone. So if you don't remember what free and total was, let's go back here. I kind of explained that on this slide here, talking about free and total, and I told you that at basal levels, only about 1 to 2% of total testosterone is active and ready to bind to receptors, where the rest of it is bound up with regulators. So now when we're exercising, this would be before we do strength training. This would be before the strength training. This would be in the middle of the strength training, and this would be immediately post strength training. And then immediately post is going to be followed by 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and 70 minutes after we're done exercising, okay? This one's looking at free testosterone. This one's looking at total testosterone. So obviously men, if we're looking at picomoles per liter, men have a much higher basal level of testosterone. It looks like about maybe 56 picomoles per liter, and women are substantially lower. This is at basal. This is at rest. We can say that women might be about 17 or 18 picomoles per liter. Immediately following the onset of exercise, we can see that free testosterone begins to increase. So if we're doing halfway through the session, we already have an increase in free testosterone. And then right when we conclude exercising, we have another stepwise increase. So we went from 50 to 80 essentially. Now, 5 minutes after we exercise, free testosterone is still elevating. And this we can say is probably about 87, 86, something like that, possibly. And then 15 minutes after we exercise, the levels start to fall. Okay. And then you can see here, they essentially normalize again, right? Where women, they have a lower level of it at basal, and they have a very little increase in testosterone over the course of that same time frame. There is a slight increase, right? But it's not the same as testosterone secretion in men. Now, the same sort of pattern happens in total cholesterol. Total testosterone. And this is slightly different measurements. This is millimoles per liter. So this is a higher number, which is why you see a lower value here. But it's let me erase this. It's a very similar trend. But what's interesting is in women, you could see that the total testosterone is very low, and there's no change at all with lifting. Now, what that means is men will liberate and perhaps increase the generation of testosterone, right? So they'll free up more testosterone, and this is total testosterone. So they're also creating it potentially, right? They're creating it simultaneously and liberating more from that previous slide I showed you, right? The SHBG, where women, women have no increase in production. So what women are doing is their increases come from the release of testosterone from albumin and the release of testosterone from SHBG. So if the takeaway message would be men are releasing it and perhaps also resynthesizing it, right? Where women are only releasing it because the total testosterone hasn't changed in women at all, but the free testosterone has. So that's pretty interesting. So that's all I have on the testosterone piece. Let's talk about growth hormones now. So growth hormones are very important in normal development, especially in child growth. They play also a vital role in adapting to stress of resistance training. So they'll play a major role in adaptations. And they do a host of things. So growth hormone, they have many physiological roles. Some of them can decrease glucose utilization. Some of them can increase protein synthesis. Some of them can increase collagen synthesis. Some of them can stimulate cartilage growth. Some of them can enhance immune cell function. Some of them can increase lipolysis. So I'm being very general on what these things can do. And they can also modify things like stress and fitness levels, and they can be modified with diet and age and gender. Adiposity, if you're overweight and you have a lot of adipose tissue, that can change how growth hormones work. Injury can also change how growth hormones work. So they're very, very susceptible to changes in physiology. Okay. So let's talk about this very complex sequence here, and we're going to talk about how growth hormones work. Okay, so the production of human growth hormone is regulated through a very complex system. And what's really unique about this is when the growth hormone is secreted, it can have an impact on developing other types of growth hormones, okay? So when human growth hormone is secreted, it can interact with the liver and other tissues, and this can lead to the generation of insulin-like growth factor, where you have basically one hormone that's a growth factor activating another hormone, which is the growth factor. So sleep, we get a lot of HGH that is elevated when we sleep. What we eat can have a profound impact on hormone levels, whether we decrease or increase hormone levels with our diet and what we eat. Stress has a robust response on the secretion of hormones, and so does exercise. And like I said, growth hormone itself can also impact the generation of other hormones. So the HGH is released by all of these types of stimuli, but what makes HGH, or just growth hormone, what makes it so unique is that this is released in a pulsatile manner, and it varies from hour to hour. So let me draw you two quick things here. Let's do a Y and an X here, and a Y and an X here, and we'll say that this is hormone, right? And this is time, so that could just be throughout the day. Hormone, time, okay? So what you guys saw on testosterone is testosterone will be in circulation constantly. We will have a rise in it depending on if we exercise, right? And then testosterone will drop, and it won't necessarily keep decreasing. It'll kind of maintain this basal level here, right? So testosterone will rise and then fall, right? What's interesting about growth hormone is it can respond to these different types of signals, but it does it in a pulsatile way. So it might go like this and elevate and then come back down, and then it might normalize or just get low, right? And then throughout another time in the day, depending on the stimulus, it might go up even higher and then come back down, and then it will be low or just off. And then later on in the day, it might elevate again. So we call this pulsatility in expression, or pulsatility in activation, and then it's going to go back down. All right, so it's almost like a pulse, right? And it's such a potent signal, and it impacts, it interacts with so many different tissues that it has to be on and off in a pulsatile fashion, because we don't want this thing constantly on. It can lead to disorders. In a lot of weightlifters who use HGH and who use testosterone, use these growth signals, we can see some of the deformities that will occur as a result of using these hormones all the time. So when it is on in a pulsatile fashion, it could be between 3 to 5 hours. And then it is highest at night from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. is when we've seen the greatest expression of that. And what's important is that you understand that growth hormone, when it's secreted, and it is susceptible to where is it at? Right here, exercise signal. So when we exercise, we can secrete and increase growth hormone signaling. Now, it is going to impact insulin-like growth factor. So look at what kind of tissues growth hormones can increase, right? So we can have an increase of cartilage. We'll have an increase of glucose utilization. And look at this, bone and tissue growth, right? So this is a pretty potent signal, and we don't want it on all the time because it impacts so many different systems. Therefore, we want it on and off, on and off, on and off, right? But when we're taking these exogenous sources of growth hormone, we're, these weightlifters, these bodybuilders that just want to get big, they're taking this pulsatile signal and they're turning it into something like this that might be a bit more chronically activated, okay? So a lot of people refer to the growth signal, HGH, as the fountain of youth, and I already told you it has a lot of different impacts on different tissues, and men above 40 are now starting to use growth hormone and testosterone therapy treatment just to kind of slow down the aging process and help kind of renew some of these systems. And one of the things I was telling you about that could be problematic is this kind of uncontrolled growth of bone that you can see in certain athletes. So let me move to this next slide here. And this is a condition called acromegaly. This is a disorder that results from excessive growth hormone use after basically growth plates have closed in adult human beings. So we can see here that in this condition, we will have this kind of unnormal enlargement of like the hands and the feet. There will be enlargement and changes in the forehead, the jaw and the nose, right? So you can see here versus here, completely different human being. You look at the jaw here, you all know who this is. He's been obviously uses growth hormone. You can see it in his body. You can see at his age, his muscle development is very, very developed. And then we can see in individuals who are using growth hormone a lot, they get this space between their teeth because the teeth don't grow, but since growth hormone does impact bone, the jawbone can grow, thereby creating more space in between the teeth. So these changes, they come with people who use growth hormone because you're compounding the use of exogenous growth hormone with what your body is producing throughout the days. This next slide here is going to show you just a general snapshot of the pulsatility of human growth hormone. And this is, of course, just representing time, right? 1,700, 1,900 hours, 2,100 hours. So we can see that here is the concentration of growth hormone. It's in nanograms per milliliter. Here is concentration, here is time, and you can see throughout the day there is pulsatility in the expression of growth hormone. Now, what's interesting about this is if we compare this to testosterone, look at testosterone in both men and in women. Even at, oh wait, I'm sorry, that's not the slide. This is the slide I wanted. Even at basal rest, right? We're not doing anything. We are just living and existing. Those levels are already elevated in the circulation. They're already present, right? Both total and free testosterone. So none of these values are ever at zero. But when we get to growth hormone, because it's such a potent signal and it impacts so much tissue, it's almost at zero. If I zoom in here, it's kind of flatlined, right? And then it goes up, and then it slowly comes down. And then here we have a little bleep, right? Here we have a little bleep. And then here, when we get into sleeping time, we can see at right about 1 a.m., it is at its highest, right? So that's why sleep and recovery with your athletes is such an important factor in training your athletes because so much repair and so much protein synthesis is going to happen while we sleep. Now, another interesting graph is here. You can see that we have serum growth hormone, and when we have basal, right, when we're just at rest, we can see here that we do have 10 nanograms, which it's not demonstrated here. Now, when we exercise, during exercising, growth hormone is lowered, right? So what does testosterone do during exercise? Well, as soon as we start exercising here, testosterone increases, and we see that in free available testosterone, and we also see that in total testosterone. There is a stepwise increase in testosterone. Interestingly, growth hormone doesn't work that way. From rest to the end of exercise, it decreases, and then time after exercise in minutes, 10 minutes after exercise, 20 minutes after exercise, 30 minutes after exercise, that substantially increases, significantly increases. So these hormones have slightly different patterns of secretion and elevation. And what I think is interesting is It almost seems that growth hormone turns off during exercise so that testosterone can do its work. And then as testosterone begins to fall, growth hormone elevates. So it's almost letting testosterone do its job first before growth hormone is secreted and starts binding to things. Okay, and here I want to start introducing you to the idea that we can kind of control the synthesis and the release of growth hormone with exercise. So just like testosterone, the release is affected by the type of training, the volume, and the rest period of what you're doing within a regimen. And interestingly, it seems like most of the research is showing that the rest period is the greatest variable. And I have a graph here to kind of show you that. The highest growth hormone increases in research come from tests that where athletes were doing close to their 1 rep max and they had 1 minute rest. So that was where researchers saw the highest increase in growth hormone. So that would suggest that growth hormone, one of the major stimulus of exercise would be that heavy weight, right? I'm writing with my right hand. That says heavy. Heavy weights, something close to your 1 rep max, and little time in between. But we know that can be problematic, right? And why could that be problematic? Because, well, the shorter the rest periods, right, the more at risk the muscle is for not performing well, right? The longer the rest period, the more the muscle responds. So shorter rest period has a greater release than longer rest period. So when you're training athletes, you might want to think about how can I optimize this secretion of growth hormone. Well, I could do it by shaving off some time on the rest periods. Like I said, rest periods are a variable. You can extend them, you can shorten them. And again, if the shorter the shorter the rest period, the weaker the poorer the muscle performance. So let's take a look at this picture here. And we have 2 groups that had exercised together. They did weight training with rest, which is the orange, and then weight training without rest, which is the black. And you can see pre and post, right? I'm sorry, pre-exercise, both groups had essentially the same levels of circulating growth hormone. And then once they finished exercising, you can see that the group in black that did not rest had a massively robust increase in human growth hormone, where the orange group that rested, they had an increase after exercising, but within 15 and 30 minutes after exercising, that was still going down, right? So it was decreasing, while the non-resting group after 30 minutes is still increasing. It's still going up. So I thought that was a really cool piece of data for you guys to look at. And I want you to try to think about how that is relevant for what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to do with your athletes. Growth hormone is important for, as I said, repair. It's an important repair process, important repair signal for protein synthesis and collagen synthesis. So how might we conduct our exercises to get that most robust response? And it seems that both testosterone and growth hormone kind of appreciate shorter rest periods and heavier weight. Now, just to kind of give you a 3-dimensional look at how we can better get growth hormone secretion, I have these rules here, and you can kind of look at these on your own. I don't need to read these to you. I took these from the book and just basically consolidated them to tell you the best story that I possibly could. So I'm going to let you read this so that you're taking an active role. I'm just going to make this a little bigger for you guys. Sorry, that's why I'm kind of doing that. There we go. And I talk about, from a training perspective, if you want to optimize HGA relief, you should build your routine around compound exercises. Okay, so what was compound exercises? Let's go back and look at what testosterone liked, right? Compound movements versus non-compound movements. Compound movements versus non-compound movements. So if you want to have elevated growth hormone levels, well, then you can do heavy weight with low rest, Or you can do just like we did with testosterone, you can do higher volume with lower rest, okay? And if we stress the larger muscle groups out, well, then we get more secretion. And again, you can read this. That's for you guys to internalize and you guys to take notes on and to be prepared to talk about something like this on an exam, but also when you're designing your programs for your final project. Now, we can't really talk about growth hormones without talking about insulin-like growth factors, which are induced by the secretion of growth hormone, right? So again, just to show you that relationship, the hypothalamus will secrete a signal which will cause the release of growth factor. Growth factor will be released into the bloodstream where it will bind to receptors in the liver, and then once the receptors in the liver identify the growth factor, it will secrete insulin-like growth factor. And as I said, insulin-like growth factor plays a role in the development of most of these anabolic signals, right? Or anabolism or protein anabolism. So this is a really important marker for both performance and health because generally when we see people exercising, right? Let's just draw a person exercising. Boop. Boop. They have a barbell over their head, lots of weight because it's bending, right? When we see people exercising, we generally see a rise in growth factor. That's an arrow going up. We see an increase in the receptors of growth factors. Or we can see an increase in sensitivity to growth factors. But the opposite is true for people who are unhealthy. Let's just draw another picture here, right? Here's an individual with a really big belly because they have type 2 diabetes. And they're just not really happy about it. So generally when we grow adipose tissue and we get adiposity, we can have fluctuations in growth hormone where they can be decreasing. We can have receptor downregulation, and we can have decreases in sensitivity to growth hormones. So generally it is an important biomarker for both health and for performance. What's interesting, though, is we don't really know a lot about growth factor with resistance training outside of what we're kind of talking about right now. So because it's pulsatile, and there's so many things that can influence and stimulate its pulsatility, it's a really hard thing to study. So we're going to leave the growth factor world now, and then we're going to go into the adrenal hormones. And with the adrenal hormones, we're going to be talking about where are they at right here? The catecholamines, right? Which you guys are very aware of, epinephrine and norepinephrine. These guys play a role in fight or flight responses. And we also will start talking about, maybe you did or did not know this, but the adrenal glands will also secrete very small amounts of estrogen and estradiol on top of both the male and female testes as well. So we know that these will also increase with exercise, and that secretion could come from the adrenal gland. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about cortisol, right? So we know that when we exercise, one of the first adaptations that happens is we can have an increase in the circulation of catecholamines. We can have longer periods of elevation of catecholamines, and we can have more sensitivity to the binding of receptors, which are those adrenergic receptors that we had talked about in the past. Not only do we get better at sending those signals, but we also get better at buffering out epinephrine and norepinephrine after the exercise has concluded. So when we want our blood pressure to drop, when we want vasoconstriction to start happening rather than vasodilation, when we want our heart rate to stop, and when we want to stop putting a lot of glucose into the blood, we're going to have epinephrine and norepinephrine begin to dissipate in the blood. So we do have enzymes that can kind of cut down their lifespan very quickly once we're done using them, okay? Also, if we talk about, we have already kind of talked a lot about estrogen and testosterone as much as we understand with weight training. So we don't really need to go into that anymore. We're going to talk about cortisol in a moment and kind of talk about this really unique hormone that is also secreted from the adrenal gland. And you guys don't need to know all of this about the medulla and the cortex and all of that with the adrenal gland. I just put it up there. We don't need to talk about that. Now, before we move on into cortisol, I wanted to show you one type of mechanism to give you an appreciation of how training adaptations may occur that might help you perform better. And we need to think about this as trainers, especially when we're talking about elite professional athletes where milliseconds count, right? The faster they are in milliseconds, the better the athlete they are. So let's talk for a moment about these catecholamines. Let's talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine. So there's a paper that I read that basically suggests that the absence of enzyme interaction is what would cause an increase in the circulation of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So as I had mentioned before, let me get a pen here. When we exercise, these catecholamines are released from the adrenal gland, right? And what tells the adrenal gland to secrete these? Well, it's the nervous system, right? The nervous system is going to communicate with the adrenal glands, and when we're doing exercise, and intensity plays a major role in how much of this is secreted, right? Because we know when this is secreted, our blood vessels are going to go from this wide to this wide, right? Those are going to cause major vasodilation, and that way we can get more blood and more of the goodies, nutrients and glucose and all that to the working muscles, right? So that's a blood vessel, that's a blood vessel. We can see the diameter of the blood vessel is going to change. We're going to get vasodilation as a result of epinephrine and norepinephrine being secreted. We're also going to get an increase in heart rate, right? And that is necessary because if the heart rate goes up and we're pumping more blood, we're going to want the vessels to be, let me clean that up so it looks more like a lumen, right? That's the, oh shoot, sorry. Let me draw that again, right? So here's the inside of the blood vessel, right? With heart rate going up, that means the heart rate's going to push more blood through the vessels to get the blood to the working muscles, which means the dilation of the blood vessels the diameter is going to get bigger, right? We get wider so that more blood can be pushed through that vessel. Now, one of the things that regulates this entire process are going to be enzymes. And I'm not going to say their name yet. We'll talk about them in a moment. They're on the next slide. Basically, once the exercise has stopped and completed, there are going to be enzymes that are going to basically want to turn this signal off. And they're going to help metabolize this signal and get rid of it so that heart rate can drop after exercise. The vasodilation can go back to its basal level, right? We got a much smaller vessel there. Heart rate's going to slow down. Blood pressure is going to drop. The amount of blood going through the veins or the vessels are going to decrease as well. And we're going to go back to a resting heart rate, right? Because if we don't have these regulators that are turning this signal off, well, then we'll be at rest and have an elevated heart rate and have elevated blood pressure and have changes in vascular dynamics, right? And we don't want that. We don't want to be sitting down and have a heart rate of 150 beats per minute, right? Especially if we're healthy and we're athletes. Now, what's interesting is that people that are dealing with diseases, and we can pick any one of them, right? Let's just talk about vascular complications, or let's talk about hypertension, right? One of the things that's happening with hypertension is these things might be circulating for longer periods of time, or there's something called SO, which stands for spill over, which means there's just too much of this circulating in the blood, right? And if we think about hypertension, we have an elevated heart rate, we have elevated blood pressure, and we have sedentary individuals, and that leads to heart attack, right? And these guys might be one mechanism that is involved in that. So if we have too much epinephrine and norepinephrine circulating during periods of rest, Well, that means those regulators that are supposed to shut these guys off aren't doing their jobs. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. So on this next slide here, I have a couple of facts about epinephrine and norepinephrine. And here's that spillover word, right? And clearance. So what does clearance mean? So that means when we have too much of it, we want some enzymes to come in and break them down. And then when we have clearance, we will have metabolites from the breakdown of those catecholamines show up in the urine, and we can measure that in the urine, and that's what we call clearance, right? So we know that the sympathetic nervous system is going to respond to exercise, right? And the higher the intensity of exercise, the greater the drive from the nervous system. And we know that the greater the drive from the nervous system, we're going to have a higher level of norepinephrine and epinephrine being secreted into the blood, right? So we start to exercise, sympathetic nervous system ramps up, exercise intensity. Let's say we're running upstairs, we're ramping up the intensity, and then we have a lot of this norepinephrine being secreted into the blood so that it can get into the tissues where it's exercising, right? Or where we are exercising. It gets into the interstitial space, and it will bind to those adrenergic receptors, and we'll just get more of this kind of throttle, right? When we have epinephrine and norepinephrine, we're kind of hitting the gas pedal. We're hitting the throttle on exercise. Now, what is interesting is how this mechanism works. What this paper suggests is that one of the adaptations that happens to exercise is not necessarily more of these catecholamines being released, but it might be due to a longer spillover time. So what does that mean? Well, that means we're secreting the same amount of norepinephrine, right? We're still have a surge of it going into the blood when we exercise, but we have a longer spillover time, which means that this hormone stays active in the blood longer. Wow, why is that happening? And as a scientist, you guys are all young, developing scientists, we have to ask ourselves, why is that happening? Well, if we're not getting more of the hormones, maybe we're getting more of the receptors on certain tissues, right? And those are being upregulated like we talked about in that last slide. Yeah, that's a possibility. Sure, we can certainly have that, right? Because as I spoke about in our last lecture, it doesn't have to necessarily be a higher level of the hormone. It could be a higher level of the receptor that the hormone's binding to. That's one possibility. Well, the other possibility is that when we're exercising, one of the reasons we're getting spillover, which means, again, a high level of these hormones in the blood, is because the exercise might be running interference on the enzymes that want to basically chew this up and metabolize it. If it doesn't make sense, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. And we have these two enzymes that are kind of all over the body. They're in the liver, the brain, the sympathetic nervous tissue. This is widely spread throughout the body. One of those enzymes is catecholmethyl transferase. Say that 50 times. Catecholmethyl transferase and monoamine oxidase, right? And you don't have to memorize these names. You can just call this COMT and MO, right? So these are the enzymes that are waiting. Let me clean this up. They're waiting to shut this down and inhibit spillover, right? But in exercise, we don't want to shut that down, and we don't want to inhibit spillover. We want this catecholamine elevated for as long as we're exercising, because if that's gone, guess what happens to intensity? It plummets. We no longer can exercise with intensity. We depend on that. We depend on that hormone to basically tell the rest of the body to keep hitting the throttle, right? Okay, so now what that's saying then is these guys who want to shut this down and stop spillover, when we exercise, these guys, the body runs interference on these, and it tells them to, hey, don't do your job. don't shut down this and allow spillover to happen because we're exercising with a high level of intensity. Isn't that remarkable? Isn't that so cool just to think that one of the adaptations that you have to exercise that might make you slightly faster is just these enzymes that are looking to shut down catecholamines. They're put on hold. They're stopped. And we don't know what that mechanism is. We just know that these things are told to yield. That's a yield sign. They're told to not do their job temporarily so that we can exercise with high intensity. Isn't that crazy? So I looked into another paper just to show you guys a picture of this, and I have this here. Now, this is dealing with heart failure patients, okay? So we have heart failure patients, and then we have healthy individuals. Now, in people with heart failure or people that are hypertensive or people that run into cardiac issues, they have an abnormally high level, I'm going to use yellow, an abnormally high level of these catecholamines circulating in the blood and ready to bind to their receptors. And we know that those are adrenergic receptors right here, right? So if there is a high level of these in the blood at rest, that means these enzymes, COMT and MO, right? If you don't remember what that is, here we go. COMT, Catechol-O-methyl transferase, and MO, monoamine oxidase. These guys might not be working. They just might not be able to recognize the high level of catecholamines in the blood. And as a result, we have a tremendous amount of spill over. So what does that mean with somebody with heart failure? That means that at rest, these individuals might have 160 beats per minute, right? I'm just picking some random number that's very high, right? Okay, so athletes, highly trained athletes, have very low resting heart rate. They could have 50 to 60 beats per minute versus 160 beats per minute for someone that is dealing with some type of heart issue, right? And the reason this might be so high is because we have these catecholamines being secreted at very high levels. They're binding to their receptors, and they're causing an increase in resting heart rate. One of the other mechanisms might be that these enzymes, COMT and MO, are just not working, right? They're not sensing the amount of catecholamines in the blood. This is how diseases start and exacerbate. One little protein, one little enzyme, one little hiccup in the physiology will change everything. And as a result, now we have somebody with abnormally high resting heart rate. Okay, this is just another picture showing the same thing. We're not going to necessarily worry about that one. Now let's look down here. We have healthy individuals, and they have very low levels of circulating norepinephrine at rest. And you can see the difference, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Look at the difference between the healthy individual and look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, right? Much, much more. Another interesting thing is they have way more receptors, right? You see these receptors here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 versus 1, 2, 3. So there's a tremendous amount of difference in the physiology. Less receptors, more norepinephrine, right? Here we have less norepinephrine, way more receptors. And this might be a result of downregulation in the person with heart failure, right? We talked about upregulation and downregulation with receptors. This individual right here might be downregulated. And that's why there's so much norepinephrine circulating, trying to overcompensate for the loss of these receptors, possibly, right? The other thing could be that not only is there downregulation of the receptors, but we also have a hiccup in how these enzymes are functioning, and they're not doing their job and picking off all of this norepinephrine to stop spillover, right? those could be some mechanisms. Now, when we have a healthy individual, let's look over here, and they begin exercising, well, they're going to have an increase in nervous system drive, which is going to cause an increase in release in norepinephrine from the adrenal gland. And what is going to happen, what happens in healthy individuals is these enzymes who are waiting to pick these off, right? They want to break them down and metabolize them. They're told to just hold tight. Don't attack the norepinephrine. Let it do its job, right? So what happens here is one of the adaptations that can occur with athletes is, sure, we can have a normal level of norepinephrine circulating. We can have an upregulation of norepinephrine receptors, but we could also have greater control and inhibition of these enzymes, which are going to stop them from wanting to terminate this signal until the exercise is done. And then once the exercise is done, these will rapidly step in and terminate these signals and stop them from binding to the receptors. And these metabolites, once they're broken down, will be cleared through the urine. Isn't that absolutely remarkable? So I wanted to share that with you to show you kind of a schematic of all these things that could be happening in athletes. And I say could because we don't know with 100% certainty just yet. We're still trying to figure that out. But, a lot of the things that we have been talking about, I'm just erasing this so it doesn't show up on your slides, is depicted here, right? So in this case, athletes could have a better control, unbeknownst to them, just the chemicals in their body, have a better control of these enzymes, and they're told to hold off, don't pick these things apart, let spillover happen for a longer period of time, which just means a high concentration in the blood. And then once the heart rate or the exercise begins to slow down and the intensity slow down, these guys are ready to come in and terminate this very rapidly. And it could also be, one of the other mechanisms could be athletes have more of these enzymes, right, than somebody who has a disease. So we can have adaptations to hormone expression. It could be higher. Norepinephrine could be circulating in higher concentrations in athletes. Athletes could have more of these receptors, right? So that they have a greater mass action when the hormone binds to the receptor, when the epinephrine binds to the adrenergic receptor, right? We could have more of these enzymes that are under better control that can pick these things off faster, because if you're done exercising, one of the things we want to understand as trainers is we want to get heart rate recovery to happen like that. We want their heart rate to drop immediately. So one of the things that might be driving very quick heart rate recovery is an abundance of these enzymes that are just way better at their job because there's more of them versus somebody that's dealing with a disease or dealing with some type of issue. So I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, so we're going to talk about cortisol here. We got a couple more slides left, and we're not going to go too much into cortisol because this is one of the few hormones we really understand fully. The cortisol is a very tricky hormone, so we're going to just talk about the basics. We know that this hormone is essentially tied to the amount of glycogen or glucose that is available for energy. So when glycogen is low, the body will use carbs and protein for fuel. Those carbs can be essentially carbs that are in the blood, right? So it will pull it from the blood rather than from the muscle or the liver, or it will start to utilize protein for energy. So cortisol plays a role in this. So this kind of works in opposition to glucose. When we have low levels of glucose or low levels of glycogen, cortisol will be elevated. It does follow the circadian rhythm, so it's the highest in the morning and it's the lowest in the evening. And chronic elevations of cortisol is detrimental, but short-term helps in muscle building process and also aids in the removal of damaged proteins. So by its very nature, cortisol is a catabolic hormone. So if we think about cortisol in its most basic form, it's the major catabolic signal. And again, it's affected by stimulating the conversion of amino acids to glucose, right? So if we have no glucose, if we have no sugar, or if we're in a state of ketosis, cortisol will also be elevated, and it's going to want to take those amino acids or those proteins, catabolize them, and break them into carbohydrates. This is one of the major hormones that's going to do that. It will also increase proteolytic enzyme activity. So what does proteolytic enzyme activity means? Well, this means the breakdown of proteins, proteolytic. So it will increase that activity. And most importantly, if things are being broken down proteolytically, then that means protein synthesis is not going to happen, okay? So think about that. Think about refeeding athletes. If we have athletes that are working out 3 to 4 to 6 hours a day, and they're not refueling the right way, we're not giving them the right carbohydrates. Well, the inaction of refeeding with carbohydrates and restoring glycogen, both in the muscle and in the liver, and normalizing blood glucose, if we don't do that through diet and we don't help these athletes refuel, then what's going to happen is cortisol levels are going to go up, and they're going to stimulate a very catabolic effect, which is going to increase proteolytic enzymes and increase protein degradation, which is going to be turned into carbohydrates. So if you don't bring it in through your diet, the body will make them independently, and one of those signals will be through cortisol. So this is called a counter-regulatory hormone as well. That's going to mobilize fat additionally. So if you look at this picture here, we can see insulin receptors, right? We can see GLUT4. You guys should all know what GLUT4 is. It helps bring glucose into the cell. We can see glucose transporters here, which also bring glucose into the cell. When cortisol is on, it is going to stop any anabolic signal. And all you should really take from this is that, let me get a highlighter, insulin is anabolic, GLUT4 is anabolic, and the transport of glucose into the muscle cell or the liver cell to make glycogen is also anabolic. But when cortisol is on, that catabolic signal is going to inhibit any anabolic growth or restore signal that the body is trying to initiate. Now, another kind of cool thing about growth cortisol is that when we work out consecutively, so think about athletes, right? They don't work out one day, they don't work out Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then take the rest of the week off. They generally tend to work out daily, right? We're not going to worry about creatine kinase. We're not going to worry about IgA. What I want you to look at here is this particular slide. So we're looking at cortisol, and we're looking at 2 days of consecutive working out or 2 days non-consecutive. So this would be if somebody worked out Monday and Tuesday, and this would be if somebody worked out Monday and Wednesday, okay? And we have pre and post levels of cortisol. Well, what I want you to realize is that here's our pre, here's our post. When we work out 2 days in a row, we are going to have significantly elevated cortisol levels compared to, look at this one over here. If we look at this guy here, it's not much higher. There is a significance, but it's not too much higher. So one of the things we have to be aware of as trainers, especially with athletes, is the possibility of overtraining and overtrained induced cortisol levels. Because if you don't stop this catabolic signal of breaking things down, right? Stop cortisol in its tracks, you will never let the athlete rebuild glycogen in the muscle or in the liver, right? So one of the ways we have to do that is by bringing in glucose, bringing in insulin, bringing in carbohydrates, bringing in complex carbohydrates, right? That is how we can stop that cortisol signal, and also by giving rest, allowing ample rest time for our athletes. But again, when we work out consecutively, So if we did Monday, Tuesday versus Monday, Wednesday, the cortisol levels are going to be much higher, which means it's much more taxing on the body, and it's harder to switch it over to that anabolic state where we want to rebuild and we want to regenerate muscle glycogen and we want to regenerate liver glycogen. Okay, so we do not want to starve our athletes. We do not want to do any type of alternative day fasting with our athletes. We do not want to do anything ketogenic with our athletes. I'm giving you cellular proof on how cortisol can be turned on and can essentially overpower the cell with these catabolic messages. Now, before we get into this slide, this is kind of a scary slide. I'm just going to give you the basics of it. Let's talk about overtraining and cortisol. So overtraining impacts both growth hormone and testosterone, and it impacts cortisol. And cortisol is directly competing with growth hormone and testosterone. Okay, and that's what that's showing you here. You can see here we have cortisol, right? And we have testosterone. And these two are in a direct competition with one another, right? So in a healthy strength training program, if we're talking about resistance training, training seems to improve anabolic hormone release, right? And we talked about that. So we talk about this anabolic signal, right? And that's here in green. So when we train, we have this increased release of anabolic signals. And we want to improve that. That's how the muscles get bigger and stronger, right? So it also teaches the body to release less cortisol, right? So those two are constantly in competition with one another. If an athlete overtrains, however, or the volume or the intensity is very, very high, well then cortisol release skyrockets. And if that skyrockets, we are in a catabolic state, right? So when we overtrain, when we don't refeed the right way, if we're training too many consecutive days in a row, then what happens is this signal of cortisol overpowers this signal of testosterone, which means break things down, build things up. And that's what it comes down to in its very essence. Okay, so the stress of overtraining will increase the cortisol production, which will increase muscle breakdown, which is basically makes it nearly impossible for athletes to build strength. Okay, so I really want you to think about that. I really want you to think about diet and the importance of carbohydrates, right? CHO. And if we have a lot of carbohydrates, well, then we're activating those anabolic signals like insulin and growth factors. And we're also restoring glycogen in the muscle and the liver, right? And all of those things are going to help us train better, train harder, increase training time, increase training volume, which will increase testosterone's anabolic signal, right? So these things all piggyback off of one another. Now, if we inhibit carbohydrates from our diet and we are no longer using that anabolic signal, such as insulin and glucose and insulin-like growth factor, and we inhibit that, well, we also inhibit glycogen restoration in the muscles and in the liver. And what happens with that is the inhibition leads to an increase in cortisol signaling, right? So we go into catabolic states. Now, if we're in a catabolic state, we're going to have more fat being used, right? Broken down. We are going to have more amino acids being broken down, right? Your proteins are going to be broken down. Your proteolytic enzymes are going to break down muscle fiber, right? I'm just going to put MUS. Those muscle fibers are going to be converted into amino acids, and those amino acids are going to be converted into carbohydrates. So that way we can keep your body alive because your body requires sugar, right? So it's important that you guys truly understand these relationships with overtraining and diet and restoration and bringing things back into the body that we need to not only restore glucose and glycogen levels, but also to stop cortisol from being so high and so elevated. So what I want you to understand here is that there is a very delicate balance between the catabolic signal that is regulated by cortisol levels and the anabolic signal that is regulated by testosterone, right? So we call this a T to C ratio, which is testosterone to cortisol ratio. And it's essentially, it's a balancing act. Now, if you are not eating the proper diet, right, you are not bringing in carbohydrates. Sorry, I'm trying to write with my right hand here and it just looks so ugly, right? CHO. If you are not building glycogen and you are increasing cortisol as a result, cortisol breaking down again the fatty acids and the amino acids, right? Well, then we are in, as athletes, a constant catabolic state. And you guys should know, without even thinking about getting a bachelor's degree, that a catabolic state for athletes is not a good thing, right? So we know that intuitively. But some other things that can kind of tip this scale are other stressors, such as lack of sleep, poor diet, mental stress. All these things will increase this cortisol release, okay? And we will have a catabolic effect that will be incredibly negative for athletic performance. So that's all I have on that particular point. Now, in conclusion, I just want to kind of talk about a couple of things here. So some of the key points is that resistance exercise, when we're talking about building strength, using high volume, large muscle groups, and short rest periods seems to be the best way to get that anabolic response, right? But if we exercise, several days in a row, and we don't rest, and we're not sleeping, and we have a poor diet, well, then that catabolic effect that we're trying to get, that anabolic effect that we're trying to get with resistance training is going to turn to a catabolic effect. And then essentially we're just wasting our time. We're wasting everybody's time. So we want to keep that in mind with the cortisol values. And if we have chronic high contraction, if we have chronic high levels or concentrations of cortisol, we'll have the adverse effect. But what is important is that an acute increase to cortisol plays an important role in muscle remodeling and maintaining blood glucose control. So when we have a release of cortisol, it's not a bad guy all the time. So let's just put C for cortisol and T for time. Very similar to what we saw with the other pulsatile hormones, is if they're on and then off, and then let's say they're on again for a short time, and then they're off throughout the day, then they're on again, right, and then off, and then while we sleep, they're very high, and then when we wake up, they turn off. This is where cortisol can be a good guy, and cortisol is going to play an important role in muscle remodeling because it's catabolic. So sometimes when we want to rebuild muscle, we have to break it down first, right? So in opposition to that, with overtraining, poor diet, what's going to happen is cortisol levels are going to do something like this, right? They're not going to be pulsatile. They're not going to be on for short periods of time. They're going to be on and elevated, and that's when we have an issue. And we can check the blood of athletes and look at cortisol levels and determine where they are. Are they too high? Are they very elevated? Are they not elevated? Well, how do we know what cortisol levels should be? Well, if you look here, this group did a measurement of resting, right, pre-test resting cortisol levels, and they said it looked like 1.5 nanometers per liter, okay? But then when they exercised 2 days in a row, it nearly tripled that. It went up to 2.5 or 3 essentially. So it doubled. And with that double in signal, we have a double in catabolic responses. So a little bit of cortisol is a good thing. Think of the three bears, right? This is too hot. This is too cold. Oh, this one's just right. When you're talking about the three bears porridge, we do want a little of it, but then we want it to go away. And one of the ways we get it to go away, is by eating the right diet. And we know that has to be rich in carbohydrates, getting plenty of sleep and plenty of rest, mental stress, eliminating as much mental stress as possible, because that's going to increase the cortisol levels. And yeah, that's the balancing act right there. So just, I guess the final takeaway is just understand that this plays a role in muscle remodeling, and just a little bit of it goes a long way. And if we have it on all the time, then the remodeling of the muscle is constantly happening, and the breakdown of muscle is constantly happening. So yeah, just kind of think about that. And then let's just backtrack one more second here and talk about some of these. Let's go here to the catecholamines. So some of the other training adaptations that happen with the catecholamines, I gave you guys a very kind of novel mechanism, right? We were looking at this, but let me give you some hard facts on catecholamines, and then we can kind of call this a day. We can stick a fork in it. So we know that catecholamines will play a very important role in force production, right, of the muscle. So if we want to push up more weight, we want to have more force production, catecholamines play a role in that. They play a role in increased muscle contraction. So while I'm saying this, you should be writing this down. They play an increase in blood pressure. Sorry about that. They increase available energy, especially with the glucose and glycogen. They increase the delivery. Sorry, I'm coughing. They increase the delivery of those goodies in the blood. And they also play a role in increasing or changing the rate of testosterone release. I'm sorry, I'm choking over here. So they can directly impact the release of testosterone and increase the rate of testosterone release. So they're all kind of favorable. Catecholamines are very favorable with exercise adaptations. So heavy resistance training has been shown to increase the ability of the athlete to secrete greater amounts of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if we go back to this, we know that through exercise and through constant training and adaptation, we can secrete more of this. Okay, so it just naturally we produce more of it. And what most of the research shows is that with strength training, one of the major first responders or first adaptations that occur with catecholamines is an increase in secretion. Okay, that's not to say any of this is wrong. I'm saying that this is very novel. So we can have more secretion of it with resistance training. We can have more upregulation of the receptors that are going to communicate with this hormone. And we can have greater control of these enzymes, which will allow greater spillover so that we have more of this signal. So perhaps maybe it's not the release of norepinephrine, but it's the control of these enzymes not shutting it down that increase the spillover. So I'm just giving you another perspective, and you guys can be the judge on that. But this is essentially how science works. Is we're trying to figure out what mechanism is playing the biggest role here. And it might just be all of them. It might be, yes, there is an increase in norepinephrine. There is an increase in the receptors. There is an increase in the enzymes that play a role in shutting this signal down once we don't need that signal anymore. There is an increase in telling these enzymes to basically hold off on breaking these things down until the exercise is over. So I'm showing you a schematic of all these different adaptations, and that's what these are. So that's what I want you to appreciate is when you do get bigger, stronger, faster, more explosive, the muscle's the last thing to change. It's all these things that are happening, and the muscle is at the very end of that timeline. That's all I have for you guys. I will be in touch very soon.